I'm going to say welcome. This brown bag is about trust, and I guess in Agile, there's a lot of things that happen in and around trust, and it's the way it's designed, etc. But a lot of this is implicit, and what we want to do is actually talk more about it. And the trust framework that Todd and Toby are going to be talking about really makes a good job of turning the implicit conversations and things that we do in and around trust and the way we work, and turning this into something explicit. So I'm going to hand you over to Toby and Todd, and they're going to introduce themselves and then going to crack on with the framework. Oh, sorry, just one thing before I do that is throughout it, if you've got any questions, we've got the Q&A function switched on. So please feel free to drop in your questions there. There's also an upvote option. So if you really like a question, please put that, upvote it, and then that'll give us a way of tackling the priority, because there's obviously going to be a big flood of questions as we go through. So do that. And I think to start with, though, just so you're not confused, an exercise right at the beginning that Todd will be doing will be using the chat function. So general questions into the Q&A, and I will now hand you over to Todd and Toby. Welcome.
Well, thank you very much. Okay, thanks everybody. Thanks for spending your time with us today, and welcome to our talk about trust. We're really grateful that you're with us. Before we get started, we want to throw out this kind of open question to all of you, just to kind of as a warm-up here. So if in the chat, if you could try to answer this question: why do we trust? So why do we trust people? Why do we trust organizations, institutions, whatever? There's no wrong answers. If you could throw your thoughts in the chat, we'll go through it in a minute. But while you're doing that, we'll just do a quick intro. So I'm Todd Anderson. I'm a principal consultant here at EXPLICIT. I'm also the founder and co-author of the Trust Framework.
Hi, I'm Toby Blackmore. I'm also a consultant at EXPLICIT, and I'm an Agile coach and also a co-author of the Trust Framework.
Okay, so I'm just going to look in the chat, see if we have any answers here. So why do we trust? Past experience. Good. It makes life easier. Thanks, Igor. When we trust others, it allows us to build teams that are stronger than the sum of their parts. That's from Sarah. To simplify things, Kathleen. To build stronger, connect. Oh, sorry, it scrolled off my page there. Build stronger connections with organizations and people. To get stuff done, because we have to get things done. Yep. You have to trust somebody, Ian. Because life is too much to not get something for some of it for free. That's a good one, Thomas. Yeah, building a sense of ownership. We trust. I feel more. We're able to trust when we feel more honest in ourselves. Because you have to. You can't do everything yourself. It cuts out the crap, Dave. That's right. Darn straight, it cuts out the crap. More enjoyable when you do in a positive regard for others. So thanks for everybody who put that in the chat. Yeah, so if we think about our day-to-day lives, we quite often trust institutions, right? So you think of the post office, and we all have experience throughout my entire life where I could walk into a shop or a post office, buy a sticker, stick it on an envelope, put the letter in a mailbox, and have it sent almost literally anywhere in the world. I didn't think much about, or really even knew about the system, international system in place to make that go where it needs to go and have everybody get paid. And I didn't really worry about it not showing up, right? Airlines, right? You might worry about whether or not your plane arrives on time or leaves on time, or you might lose your baggage, but I don't worry much about the plane falling out of the sky, right? And I don't worry when I fly over international borders that it's going to get shot down or something. And payments. So I'm sure we all did, if not today or yesterday, but day before, you walk into a store, you grab your items off the shelf, you go to a self-checkout, you wave your phone in front of a magic black box, it says approved, you walk out with your stuff. Nobody ran after you, nobody got upset. You didn't particularly worry whether your account was debited or not correctly. And so these are all kind of examples of trust in our day-to-day lives. So if we think about the benefits of trust, there are many, and some of them were in the chat earlier. But one thing is, it's a very human thing to do, right? So, our society and our culture are kind of very well based off trust. And if you thought about the alternative, it'd be very exhausting not to trust, right? If we had to barter for our goods, or if we had to do everything ourselves, it'd be a really exhausting way to live. And perhaps back in history, when things were more tribal and then societies were closed, things advanced slowly. There's no free exchange of ideas or goods or services. So, it's a very human thing to do. And potentially, maybe if a group of humans got together, maybe spontaneously, we would start trusting each other and building societies. Who knows? And also, I say human, but, there's also a lot of evidence that animals do a similar sort of thing. I think I've seen plenty of wildlife documentaries that would suggest that. So number two, it saves time. So, I think all the examples I put forward in the previous slide really show that. Our Tesco here just put in entire self-checkouts for entire carts of things, not just one or two things. So, and I use them because it's faster, it's more convenient for me, and it saves time. It promotes freedom and liberty. So this one is maybe not as intuitive, but if you think about it, if you trust somebody, you're really kind of granting them the freedom and liberty to live their lives and optimize them the way they see fit, right? So this is not in society, but if you think about within development teams, right? If we're really clear about our roles and responsibilities, it means that people are free to maximize their own experience, and that's really to the benefit of everybody. And then last one, and this was mentioned in the chat, it's a happier way to live, right? Overall, trusting really enriches our society and makes our lives better and happier. And when I was writing my notes to this slide, I actually said, I'm really glad that I could enjoy the fruits, like literally enjoy the fruits of this complex relationships of commerce that we have around the world. We can just walk down the street and get produce from any country, but of course, given our tomato and pepper shortage, I guess maybe that's a counterexample that's relevant. So yeah, those are the benefits of trust. I'll hand over to Toby here.
So we've talked a bit about personal trust and trust in our personal relationships. So how does trust function in the workplace? Often parts of the business don't trust each other, and we react to everything as a risk. Once the negative outcomes that happened, do you want to put the slide forward, Todd? Sorry. Once the negative outcomes happened, we put in process to address the issue, and we feel this was the responsible thing to do. For example, when a delivery deadline's missed, we add in extra reporting. Our ways of working, though, need to save time and provide more value and better outcomes. In our personal life, we have more limited resources than we do at work, and we use more judgment. In the aircraft example earlier that Todd talked about, we don't review all the performance reports of the aircraft engineers or the pilots before we get on the plane, because that would be really time consuming and inefficient. We wouldn't necessarily have the expertise to do it well either. So we may take in some extra information if we have concerns, but there's a limit to what we can do. So why is there a difference? In our personal lives, there's a lot more social proof. There are many other people consuming the services or interacting with other folk, and their experiences help us to trust. If we've got a bad experience with buying from a shop, often we're lucky enough to be able to walk out and go to a different shop, change providers. Things at work, you can't just opt to not work with a certain team. So because of that, it should become the responsibility of the whole business to help us trust each other, and therefore help us to work together efficiently. It shouldn't be an individual issue. So have a think about your workplace experiences and how trust levels would have made a difference. Thinking about some of the agile concepts, we can actually end up with quite poor behaviors in low trust environments. Some examples here. So if we take transparency, if we think about high trust, then you may share a roadmap with your team so they can be part of the decision-making process from the start. In a low trust environment, this might mean delivering a status report that nobody ever reads to cover yourself. I'm sure we've all seen this. If we take collaboration, you know, in a high trust environment, you may enter the collaboration with a vulnerability and an expectation to learn and adapt. With low trust, you may enter the collaboration to just validate your current understanding. Thinking about feedback, high trusts, you know, feedback's high frequency with the aim to improve, and we're able to act on the data even if it's negative. And low trust, we possibly cherry pick things to validate the existing approach. And then thinking about changes and expectations. So with high trust, we'd create an environment to facilitate change, where doing the right thing based on your current information is the expectation. But with low trust, change can seem as deviation from a plan. So how do we need to change? We spoke about Agile earlier, Dave mentioned it. So Agile is good at encouraging people to adopt methods that build trust. And this framework we're talking about has its roots in Agile. The thing with Agile is it doesn't make trust an explicit goal. As Agile evangelists, we go into businesses and we say, hey, we need to be more Agile. But that can be a hard sell. Leadership teams don't always understand why we should be more Agile. We're talking about concepts here and this trust framework that might seem quite high level, but we actually all understand trust. We all, you know, we're able to answer that question quite easily about why we trust. So ways of working should build and support trust, but actually often they weaken it. So we've all agreed on the benefits of trust. So we should make trust the explicit goal. And we should do this from the very start, from the hiring process onwards.
So now that you understand the value of trust, enter the trust framework. So we wrote the trust framework as a way to collect and organize ideas around trust, not just because the world needed another framework. And it also serves the benefit of actually giving us something that we can improve and point to so we can implement it in our organization. And the trust framework really starts with this axiom, which is maximizing trust throughout the organization in all directions creates a more efficient and happier working environment, resulting in higher value creation for the organization and its stakeholders. So just to unpack that a little bit, like we put the in all directions bit in there because it's really to show that these trust relationships happen all directions, up, down, between leaderships, between teams, sideways, between individuals, between other teams. It's not just top down or bottom up. Ultimately, though, what we're saying here is that trust produces higher value and affects the bottom line, which really kind of validates why we'd want to invest in maximizing trust in the long term. And this axiom then becomes an anchor that we can keep coming back to when we need to justify why it's important to invest in these relationships. So with that, we use this model, which is based off of a paper by Graham Dietz in the Journal of Trust Research, and we sort of simplified it a bit here. But this just kind of gives us a mental model for us to think about as we go forward. So the trust model, first you have the inputs into the model. So this is the trustee's character, motive, abilities, behavior, the nature of the trustee-trustor relationship, situational influences like institution, culture, roles, and reputation, domain-specific concerns, and the truster's predisposition to trust. Then next, so we have these kind of inputs going into the relationship. Then we have beliefs about trustworthiness that are kind of formed from those inputs. Then there's kind of a point where there's the vulnerability and making the decision to trust. And we also consider consequences at this stage. And then finally, there's the risk-taking action. So this is where we've decided to put our chips down and actually decide to trust somebody. And then importantly, there's this loop that comes off the back and that goes in the back. And this is kind of feedback loop based on the outcome. So based on the outcome of that risk-taking action, that feedback loop now becomes the input for the next time around when we come trusted. And that's a really important concept to understand because we're going to come back to that later on in this talk. So now we have a model. Let's kind of look at just generally a relationship, a trust relationship here. So I'm just going to explain this slide here. So on the left, we have this kind of trust level, high trust being on top, low trust being down at the bottom. And then across the bottom axis there, we have kind of the relationship life cycle. So pre the relationship through to like delivering something and ongoing. And then in the middle, we have the squiggly line, which kind of represents the relative trust level. And that's kind of how this slide is laid out. And although it's really just a generalization here, obviously there's a continuous ebb and flow to trust, and it's not an exact thing, but it's a generalization. So to start off, we have the starting point delta. So we're going to start at a higher or lower level, given our kind of inputs into the trust model, like how our predisposition to trust and our existing relationship is really going to move that delta. And so early in a relationship, you know, we have the euphoria of a new relationship. There are many possibilities and good intentions and infinite possibilities, right? Then we kind of go into a learning and discovery phase where it's highly collaborative. Our relationship grows and our trust grows, and the parties start to render themselves a little bit vulnerable and open up to each other and decide to take the risk to move forward. Then we actually get into iterative development, or developing whatever it is we're working on. And maybe there's a little bit of a dip here because, you know, the rubber is going to hit the road here. You know, we've taken the risk, but now constraints start manifesting, issues start arising, and it tests the relationship. But then finally, we release something, hopefully, and the risk-taking action has either paid off or it hasn't paid off. In the case where it paid off, where this kind of branch goes up here, that becomes a kind of a new high, a new starting point for the next time around when we come through this cycle. And if the risk didn't pay off, if things didn't go well, then there's kind of a dip in trust that becomes again a new starting point, but it's much lower than if it were successful. So I just want to highlight this point here and this kind of result of this action, because we're going to come back to this. So with that being said, now that we know the what of the trust model, let's talk about how you can actually build trust. So the root of building a high trust environment is establishing a trust culture, and that's probably not news to anybody. So how do we do that? We establish trust values and make them an organizational priority, supported and adopted by leadership. We try to create adult-adult relationships within the organization and its suppliers with mutual respect at the same level. And this is versus an adult-child or command and control type relationship, you know, where somebody's dictating to someone else. We want to really create a no-blame culture where problems are shared and improvements are incremental. We want to make sure we establish psychological safety at the team level. And because if you don't feel safe, it's really difficult to be vulnerable, and being vulnerable is really part of the trust model. The more we can do to have people be able to put themselves out there in a safe environment, the stronger our trust relationship is. Then finally, I think delivering against commitments is of utmost important. At the end of the day, the proof's in the pudding, and success acts like a springboard for future relationships. But to be able to deliver your commitments, we need to be very clear on our expectations at the beginning and throughout the relationship. And then finally, obviously working in transparency and in a collaborative manner, as discussed before. Once we've built a high trust environment, now we need to sort of continuously manage it, right? So ongoing trust management is really about awareness and actively managing trust. And this means dealing with trust issues as they arise and not letting them fester. So we need to have mechanisms in place to both detect trust issues and also address them as soon as they arise. It's really important to note that trust is really everybody's responsibility. It's kind of like the concept of quality. Like, everybody has a stake in trust relationships and their outcomes. But although it's everybody's responsibility, you might want to consider having specific roles that are more focused on trust. So Maybe a more lighter touch approach could be having just trust champions who are people who are interested in this and developing trust throughout the organization, helping their teams manage it. Or in your situation, or in addition, you could have a more dedicated role, a sort of trust leadership role, where somebody is actually dedicated to the pursuit of establishing trust in your organization. But the important thing is to really continuously review, invest, and improve trust, especially in long-term relationships where trust is often taken for granted.
So, looking into a bit deeper into how trust can change. So, over time, working with people more, we'd expect naturally to gain trust. But what happens when we lose it? It's natural for events to happen which can cause this, but how we deal with them is important. So this image shows a graph, again, made up of trust over time, and a branching event which could lead to higher or lower trust. If we do lose trust, we need to intervene with the goal of getting back to the previous trust level. A common reaction to a loss of trust event is to put in more process to prevent it from happening again, which we feel can seem sensible. But you will have all seen this. Additional process often adds inefficiencies, and they can further erode trust. For example, through increased surveillance of individuals or more oversight or checking of work. We end up trusting people less, which can disempower or demotivate them. And then those processes can be left in place for years, just because something happened once and that trust isn't ever recovered. Think about the number of times that you've come across a process at work where nobody can really even explain why it exists, or they only have a distant memory in the past of an event that maybe caused it to be created. So how should we be intervening? Think about the problem we're actually trying to address and use a lens of trust to think about how we could solve that issue. As a temporary measure, we could put in some more oversight or process, but it would help if it was agreed by all parties, and the goal should be to gain trust. Don't just add process to facilitate a non-trusting state. In the early example about adding reporting after a deadline is think about why that would help. Is it to reassure a stakeholder? Do they need to be reassured continually? Because that can become inefficient and exhausting, as we mentioned before. Is it to help to provide useful interventions? And is it actually something that we all think is a great idea? Or is it in a non-trusting way, just a method of everybody covering their backs and there aren't any steps to positively affect the future deliveries? Also, be careful the process doesn't lead to other poor behaviors. We know, for example, that adding monitoring such as time tracking to a dev team can cause them to try and game it or focus on the wrong things, just as long as they keep logging that time. If you do put in temporary process, keep those measures in review, and once trust has been re-established, look at removing that process. So this slide shows a branch at a potential event where two possible outcomes could occur, one where trust is gained and one where it's lost. If you think about it, ideally we want to minimize any trust losses and maximize trust gains. So we shouldn't be having big drops in the amount of trust that we have. And if this does happen, it can be an indicator of a low trust environment. Maybe we were just waiting for something to go wrong. You know, if Todd did something that caused me to suddenly lose a lot of trust in him, then you would have thought he'd either done something really catastrophic or I just wasn't sure about him in the first place. If we're focusing on quick trust recovery, though, we'll want to take preventative action before this event takes place to not let that trust drop too much if we can see it coming. Coming back to agile approaches, we've got a toolkit to help with this, obviously. Transparency, we've mentioned before, and think about this with a trust lens. But try and create an environment to prevent those big trust drops. To be clear, though, trust doesn't mean to not have process. It means having process that helps every trust. So there's obviously high-risk situations where process is essential. For example, gun handling or quarantine protocols. But the process needs to be beneficial and agreed by all parties involved. We shouldn't have processes because one person doesn't trust part of the business. We should have them because there are mutual benefits. For example, we should all want a safety process for a high-risk situation like gun handling, and we shouldn't just be doing it because there's a law that tells us to do it. Process needs to save time, provide better outcomes, and that needs to be in proportion to the risks that it addresses. Again, use agile thinking. Can we reduce the risk by having more smaller or more frequent interactions? How can we be more transparent? And as we mentioned before, retrospect on ways of working. Think specifically about trust, though, and potentially remove process. And finally, remember to think about the other party's motivations. Sometimes there's some information that you don't know which is driving the behaviors. We're often dealing with imperfect information. Just as an example, when a company's going through IPO, there's information that's influenced decision-making that most employees won't have access to, and the leadership team will be legally bound not to share. The trust culture and level of trust will help. Sometimes you just have to ask for trust, and your previous actions will help, allow people to trust you, but you're spending trust credits and you need to pay that back at some point. Should we always trust, though? We shouldn't be that naive, right? Sometimes you do your best to trust, but you're continually shown by the other party that they cannot be trusted. It's okay to break a relationship off if you put in a good faith effort. For example, sometimes you might want to leave your job if they don't trust you or if that trust can't be regained. And if you feel like you have restricted process, which you can't remove, and that's because there is a trust issue or something can't be trusted, something needs to change. However, we should always try and gain trust up until that point.
So measuring trust itself is pretty difficult. It's difficult because you can't just subjectively go and ask people about trust. So you can't just give somebody a 10-point scale to measure their level of trust. So I can't just go to Toby and say, tell me how much you trust me from 1 to 10. It just doesn't work that way. It might work better at the team level potentially, but the main thing is you can't just boil it down to percentages. If you have 99% trust satisfaction, what does that even mean? If anybody has a feeling of not being trusted, then there's an issue that needs to be addressed. So really, to understand trust, emphasis should be placed on their people's behaviors and actions. So we use individual feedback to identify areas that need to be addressed and co-plan a path back to trust. And that trust path may likely result in inefficiencies. In the short term, for example, we may need to meet one-on-one for a period of time, as long as there's a path back to trust. It's likely in high trust environments, though, we should see improved outcomes based on it as a measure. So things like increased throughput of quality work into production, improved agility of the organization and how the organization manages trust, improved overall team happiness, better team psychological safety, and maybe a reduction in the number of trust-related incidents. Admittedly, though, this area needs a lot more work. So if you have ideas around this, we do want to hear from you. So in summary, let's recap some practical steps you can take to implement the framework. So establish a trust culture with accountability that works for your organization. Foster a no-blame culture of change with psychological safe environments where vulnerability can be fostered. Make trust the explicit goal. Don't rely on implicitly building trust, as mentioned before. Bring it front and center. Be clear about your objectives. Ambiguousness is the enemy of building trusted relationship. Be vulnerable and clear about what you really want and are expecting. Empower people to solve problems. Trust is about empowering people and giving them freedom to work in a way to solve problems. Review your trust processes through a trust lens. So as mentioned before, some processes necessary, but make sure it works for all parties involved. Look to remove processes where mistrust is the driver, or at least have a plan to remove the trust when it's restored. Remove the process when it's restored. Address trust issues as they arise. Don't let them fester. Use retrospectives as tools to talk about trust-related issues and incrementally improve them in your ways of working. And invest in trust. Going back to the original axiom, investing in trust is investing in a better, happier, more efficient way to work. And although a lot of this advice is applicable at the organizational level, but it's also applicable at the team level. So think about how your team interacts with other teams and stakeholders through a trust lens. And think about how you look at trust in your internal team processes. consider the role of trust champion, and use retrospective to gauge trust within your teams. So how can you help join our community? So we're really looking to build a community around developing this framework and the methods around it. But what can you do right now? Well, number one, I can say that you could probably put your questions in the Q&A that we'll cover in a bit. So just a reminder on that. But everybody has a story about trust. So a lot of times things might have gone off the rails in a work environment. And then when you actually kind of dig into it, you might see that it was actually maybe a trust issue that had been identified long beforehand, and it just eventually got out of hand. Like, what could you have done differently in that relationship if you could have identified that? Another thing you can do right now is book time in your calendar next week, maybe a half an hour, just to think about your own definition of trust. So honestly, think about what trust means to you. What are your trust gainers? What are things other people can do that'll gain trust with you? And also, think about how, if you look at things through a trust lens, how it can improve your relationships at work and maybe even outside. And then you can have a conversation with your peers about trust, or even do a lunchtime talk like this, maybe within your organization. And if you want some sort of like slide deck like this, reach out to us and we'd be definitely happy to help supply materials for that. But like I say, we're really looking to build a community around this to help develop the framework. So to do that, visit our website, trust-framework.com, where you can actually read the latest version of the framework. You can download it. You can find all of our contact details. So do reach out. You can join our Discord channel. The link is also on the website. Right now, it doesn't really do anything, but we're hoping to develop that as kind of a channel to help coordinate this community. And the next thing we're trying to do is develop a playbook. So we understand that we need to develop more practical workshops and trust management techniques. So it's kind of really our next natural focus is to develop this playbook. So please do help us. And finally, if you have any questions, comments, or need further support, just contact us via the information on the website. So with that, thank you so very much. We really appreciate you spending your time with us today. I hope you really enjoyed it and gave you a little food for thought. Please, again, join our community, take that action. We'd really appreciate that. And now I'll hand it over to Dave to do the Q&A if there's any questions.
Hello again, everybody. Yes, so I've pulled out just from the chat channel a couple of questions that are slightly derived. So first one was from Claire, which is how much crossover is there with the Maslow hierarchy of needs model? So do you want to elaborate on that at all?
It just feels that model has quite a big element of trust around it, especially when you look at the safety element. And I know it's not a founded, scientifically proven model, but it's a very popular one. It's something that's looked at in the organizational kind of psychology in a lot of organizations. And is there any crossover? It was more of an open question, really, to get people's thoughts, more of a discussion point.
Well, what we've seen is there's lots of papers and lots of work being done at the moment, and lots of crossover with other people talking about trust, but there doesn't seem to be so much practicality. And I know we've done a quite high level thing. There's a lot more actually in the framework, and as I said, we're working on this playbook at the moment, but it's really making this a real focus. I think as you know, a lot of what we've said is we naturally do as part of Agile, right? We're naturally sharing things and trying to, work together and all the things, but we just don't talk about it as a priority. That's not really answering your question, but I would say there's lots of crossover with other research and other thinking.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, I think there's a lot of intersection too with things like psychological safety and all those kind of initiatives that we're doing at EE and whatnot. And yeah, we keep seeing these synergies between this and a lot of other things we're working on, and the concept of vulnerability, which was also a previous brown bag talk and whatnot. So yeah, I think there's definitely a crossover of the Maslow hierarchy as well as all these other concepts.
Thank you.
Cool. Okay, so the next one from Nicolai. Are we going to have access to the slides? They look pretty good.
Thanks. Yeah. I'm sure we could probably distribute them.
Where would you do that? Where would you like to?
How about? That's a good question. I'm not sure how. That's probably a question for Sheila. How do we distribute things? Otherwise, we can make it available on our website as well, but maybe there's a more direct way as well. We'll work on that.
I've got an idea. So we can, when we send out the recording of this here, we can include a link into that recording.
That's exactly what I was going to say. We can put it in there. We can also, when we put up the recording, we'll add it onto your post in the news channel. We can put it there, and also Dave, you'll put it onto the description for the video.
Yep.
Link the two on the description. So plenty of ways to get it.
Failing all of that, hit me up on Slack. I'll find a way to get a PDF to you.
No problems.
Great. Okay. So the next one was from Sarah. Thinking about HMRC, the old school part, where would you start when it feels like so much of the entire organization is built on a lack of trust?
Well, I think my initial reaction is just to talk about it and bring it up, because I think that when we were first talking about this back when we started forming these ideas, it kind of comes back to that, like we always implicitly build trust, right? You'll read an article, there's plenty of articles about trust out there, and you'll read it and you're like, yeah, smile and nod and realize that's great, right? But then like, how do you actually action it? Like, we all know we need to trust each other, but there's kind of nothing we can point to actually do it. So part of developing the framework was to kind of create this kind of noun that you could point to and sort of say, hey, I heard about this thing, this trust framework. Like, let's just have a conversation about it. Like what, let's just actually maybe do a little retrospective. Like, so what I've done in a couple teams is I've just done a retrospective, and I think Toby has done a similar thing, where I just ask the question, like, why do we trust people? Like, what are trust gainers for you, and things like that, and sort of open up that vulnerability and then start to institutionalize it. So I don't know if Toby, if you have any other.
And also, as I said, just start using the word trust a bit more. Like, as I said, we just don't really say, is this because we don't trust you? And I've started raising it with people since we've been doing this at all levels of the organization who I've been speaking to, and I'm starting to hear it coming back to me as well. It's starting to become more of the vocabulary. So we always have to start small and try and influence out. But as I said, just try and start bringing it into some conversations that you have with people. Just as an example, the other day, I had somebody asking, they were going to develop a report with lots of data in to try and prove something. And I said, why are you trying to prove this? We all know this is a problem. Can we, is it because they don't trust you that you feel you have to make a big report showing something we all know already? So just try and think how you can bring it into those conversations.
I think the other thing I'd say too is, if you can just start small in your team too, right? You can just do a retrospective within your team. Say, hey, we're going to do a different one this week. We're going to just talk about trust within our team. And then similarly, that becomes something that's either useful and you can develop within your team. And then you can kind of talk about that in the wider organization and kind of do a brown bag or something more relevant to your organization to talk about. So yeah, start small, don't take big chunks, but start using the terminology and the wording. Hopefully that answers your question.
Cool. Okay, I'm going to move on to the next question, which is from Kathleen. What is your advice on the top 3 things that you could do better to help rebuild trust in a team? Clearly, it's a long-term thing, but for the short term.
Yeah, and actually, that we did a workshop when we were kind of talking about the trust framework, and the long-term relationship thing actually came up, and what often happens is, like, again, kind of going back to that kind of graph, like you have euphoria in the beginning of a relationship, it's new, possibilities are endless, and then you're going on a long time, like like HMRC or John Lewis or whatnot, like the different clients, we've been in those places a long time, and so sometimes we take that trust for granted and we maybe just assume we have a level of trust, but in the meantime, maybe the entire team has shifted out. Maybe the entire client team has rotated out, and you're kind of like living off the laurels of your previous reputation. But I think what you really need to do, number one, is check that that's even true, that you actually do have that level of trust that you assume you do, because you might not, you may make that assumption. So that's one thing you can do. Again, talking about it in general, I think is a good thing. And the third thing, I don't know. Toby, you got a third thing?
When we talk about it, it's addressing those concerns as well, right? Because again, there's a lot of hidden information that we all have. You know, something happened, as we said, that may have caused you to lose trust, and you sometimes hold on to that because it hasn't been specifically addressed. So when we have done just general trust retros within the team, you know, everyone's actually been quite vocal and open. And when we talked about your trust gainers, everybody has things that make them trust more, where they're potentially seen behaviors in other people that, you know, we're not realizing are affecting those trust levels. And as I said, we're not talking and actioning on those issues. You know, we sometimes talk about specifics, but it's not the, you know, we're not trying to solve it with that trust lens. So you know, I'd start by reflecting and talking about it.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to move on to the next question, which is, where do you see the greatest need, leadership or below?
Yeah, so, you know, I think we said that trust is really kind of everybody's responsibility. However, that being said, you know, to really improve and kind of instill these things, it needs to be, those institutional values need to be established, and that might mean investment in trust. So that's why we wrote that axiom, and kind of going back to that axiom, the assumption of that axiom is that the more trust we have in an organization, the more efficiently we'll deliver value to our stakeholders and our users. So if you kind of go back to that, then that really kind of justifies the investment in the trust. So I think leadership needs to understand it and talk about it, and actually, like, you know, depending on your situation, like if you don't trust leadership from your team, or there's kind of like a, you know, like, oh, what are you doing? And there's that kind of like a surveillance type command and control, then that's definitely something that you'd want to talk about. So I think it goes both ways, but
and this is the crazy thing, like we you know, loads of people in loads of businesses don't trust the leadership. Lots of times the leadership don't trust everybody else. We've had, you know, as we've been talking to people over the past few months, we've heard all sorts of stories, and, you know, it seems just so common that, you know, there's barriers between, you know, teams, people, all sorts of levels. And, you know, we don't want to focus on the sorts of processy stuff too much, but, you know, we do end up building in loads of things to just address this trust issue, rather than trying to say, how can we actually, you know, solve that trust problem?
Okay, thank you. I'm just going to go in for one last question. I'm just conscious of time. So where do you see the greatest need? Oh, sorry, that's one we've already done, isn't it? I've already done that one. So I think that is it, unless there's any more last second questions that come up. Okay, no, so I think I'm going to go with a really big thank you to Todd and Toby for it. Really great talk, really interesting. I hope everybody else found it interesting as well. So thanks.
Thank you all. Appreciate it.